Imagine a bomb made of food. On December 22, 1977, inside 45 reinforced concrete towers, the air itself became more volatile than gunpowder. This is the forensic anatomy of the deadliest grain explosion in modern history, where a single empty conveyor belt triggered a structural failure that defies engineering logic. Grain does not look dangerous. It sits in towers, grey and quiet, the way it has for a century. That's the deception. Reduce a kernel to dust, fine enough to hang in air rather than fall through it, and you've built something else entirely: a fuel source. Forensic analysts studying combustible particulates recognize 5 conditions that must converge before catastrophe becomes possible: fuel, oxygen, an ignition source, dispersion of that fuel through the air, and confinement to hold the pressure once it builds. Remove any single one, and nothing happens. Grain elevators removed none of them. Inside the Continental Grain facility, 4 of the 5 conditions were already satisfied before anyone raised an alarm. Fine dry particles drifted from the conveyor systems, settling in layers across beams, ledges, motor housings, anywhere horizontal, anywhere still. Oxygen filled the silos at ordinary concentration, doing nothing suspicious, doing exactly what oxygen always does. The concrete towers themselves, 45 of them rising as part of a complex of 73, provided the confinement: thick walls, sealed chambers, structures built to hold grain, which meant they were also unintentionally built to hold an explosion. What was missing was ignition. An ignition in a facility like this doesn't require malice. It requires an anomaly, a spark, a hot surface, a point of friction most people would never notice. Here's what should trouble you. None of this required sabotage. None of it required an unusual event. The lethal concentration of airborne dust that these conditions produce isn't rare inside a grain facility. It's routine. It happens every day. In dust clouds we'd call ordinary if we could see them the way an analyst does. Consider the physics for a moment. A block of coal burns slowly because oxygen can only reach its outer surface. Grind that same fuel into microscopic particles, suspend it in air, and you've multiplied its surface area by thousands. Every particle now has its own independent contact with oxygen. The chemistry that once took minutes can now happen in milliseconds. This isn't just a physics lesson, it's a death warrant. Every microscopic particle increased the fuel's surface area by thousands, meaning the chemistry that usually takes minutes to burn now happened in milliseconds, right beneath the feet of workers who thought they were safe. Grain dust performs the same transformation, and does it worse. Studies place its explosive potential at up to 50 times that of coal dust, under equivalent suspension. So picture that elevator on the morning of December 22, 1977. Workers moving through routine tasks, machinery humming at its normal register, nothing visibly wrong. And yet, according to the physics that governs particulate combustion, the building had already met almost every requirement for its own destruction. It was waiting on one thing: a trigger, and that trigger was already turning somewhere in the belt system, generating heat nobody was watching for. Somewhere in that facility, a conveyor belt was moving. And it was moving wrong. But here is the anomaly that investigators would later call the ghost in the machine. While the facility hummed with routine, a silent, invisible killer was accelerating deep within the belt system. It wasn't a fire yet, it was a countdown. Louisiana Agriculture Commissioner Gil Dozier examined the wreckage in the days following the collapse, and his conclusion was specific, almost clinical in its precision. We believe we have established that it is highly likely the conveyor belt was operating without a load, which should not have occurred. Read that again slowly. Without a load. A belt engineered to carry grain was running empty. Friction against friction, metal against metal, with no material cushioning the contact. That single operational detail matters more than almost anything else recovered from the site. A loaded conveyor belt behaves predictably. Grain buffers the mechanical components, absorbing vibration, distributing heat, keeping temperatures within a narrow, survivable range. Strip that load away, and the belt runs against bare rollers, bare bearings, surfaces never designed to grind directly against one another. Heat accumulates in a single, isolated point, not evenly, not safely. It concentrates. This is where systemic failure enters the picture, not as an abstraction, but as a mechanical fact. Safety protocols in grain handling explicitly prohibit unloaded belt operation for exactly this reason. It wasn't an obscure regulation, it was foundational. And somewhere in the operational rhythm of that facility, on an unremarkable December morning, that protocol failed to hold. Workers elsewhere in the complex had no visibility into this. They were doing what they did every day, moving grain, monitoring output, following procedures that had never produced a catastrophe before. There was no alarm, no smell of smoke, No visible spark, just an unladen belt, spinning, building thermal stress in a location none of them could see. Friction alone doesn't need to produce flame. It only needs to produce enough heat to reach the ignition threshold of suspended dust nearby. And grain safety experts have long acknowledged how little margin that threshold allows. Years later, grain safety expert Schoaf would state it plainly. There probably is no foolproof method for preventing explosions, adding that grain dust can be touched off by a spark or static electricity. No foolproof method. Not sabotage. Not a design flaw exclusive to Westwego. A structural vulnerability built into the very nature of the material. Somewhere in that belt housing, temperature crossed a line that no gauge in 1977 was built to detect in time. And that anomaly, quiet, mechanical, almost boring in its simplicity, was about to reach the one thing standing between an overheated bearing and mass casualty, a cloud of suspended dust waiting in the air above it. The transition from heat to fire, in a system like this, happens faster than human reaction time, faster than a hand pulling back from a hot surface, faster than a shout of warning could travel down a corridor. A single point of ignition met a pocket of dust suspended near the conveyor, and combustion began. Not a slow burn. An instantaneous chemical reaction across every particle in contact with oxygen simultaneously. Picture for a moment a controlled demonstration of this same reaction in a laboratory setting. A small chamber, a measured cloud of grain dust, a spark introduced under observation. The flash is near instant, over before the eye fully registers it, and yet the pressure spike on the instruments is enormous. That is the mechanism. Multiply the chamber by an entire industrial structure, and you begin to understand what was building inside Continental Grain's elevator complex. This was the primary explosion, and here's the detail forensic reconstruction keeps returning to. It was, by the standards of what came next, contained ignition, localized, survivable in isolation. A flash of pressure within a confined pocket of the structure, not yet touching the full volume of the facility. But confinement is exactly what makes a primary explosion so dangerous, not because of what it destroys, but because of what it disturbs. The pressure wave from that initial ignition didn't stay where it started. It propagated outward through the interconnected silo network, hitting beams, ledges, walls, every horizontal surface where dust had been quietly accumulating for who knows how long. Differential pressure surged through those passageways, and every layer of settled particulate matter it touched was thrown violently into the air. Think about what that means physically. Dust that had been inert, resting, harmless in its settled state, was now airborne throughout the entire structure. Air turbulence spiked. What had been isolated pockets of risk became a continuous facility-wide suspension of combustible material. Somewhere in that turbulence, workers who had felt nothing more than a distant thump moments earlier were now standing inside an atmosphere that no longer resembled breathable air. It resembled fuel. This is the part investigators studying dust explosions describe almost as a law of physics, rather than an unfortunate coincidence. A minor primary explosion doesn't end the danger. It multiplies it. The very act of exploding disperses more fuel than existed before the explosion began. There is a bitter irony buried in that mechanism. The building's own attempt to release pressure became the exact process that armed it for something worse. So, somewhere in those seconds, and it was seconds not minutes, Continental Grain's elevator complex went from housing a single, small, contained ignition event to housing something else. A structure now filled, floor to ceiling, silo to silo, with the exact 5 conditions required for catastrophe: fuel, oxygen, confinement, dispersion, and an active ignition source that had just proven it worked. The primary blast wasn't the disaster, it was the detonator for the disaster. Whatever happened in the next fraction of a second would not be contained, it would not be isolated, it would not be survivable in the way the first explosion had been. Here's the number that should stop you. 50 times. That's how much more explosive suspended grain dust is than suspended coal dust under equivalent concentration. And the entire facility had just been converted into equivalent concentration. The secondary explosion didn't need to search for fuel. The fuel was everywhere, aerosolized by the pressure wave that came before it, filling the full air volume of the structure like a fog no one could see. And when that fog ignited, it ignited everywhere at once. 48 of the 73 concrete silos ruptured, not cracked, not damaged. Ruptured simultaneously under pressure that exceeded the structural tolerance of reinforced concrete by a margin engineers don't typically design for, because they don't expect to need it. The 250-foot main tower took the worst of it. Structures like that are built to resist wind load, seismic shift, the accumulated weight of stored grain pressing outward against reinforced walls. They are not built to resist an internal detonation traveling through every connected chamber at once. The tower's failure wasn't gradual. It was total steel reinforcement, twisting, concrete fracturing along lines that had no business fracturing, differential pressure tearing through joints that had held for years without complaint. I want you to sit with the scale of that for a moment. This wasn't one silo failing, it was 48 in the same instant, feeding a single catastrophic tower collapse. Imagine, side by side, two images. One silo ordinary, grey, holding grain the way it had for years. The other expanding outward in a fire cloud that consumes its own structure in less time than it takes to draw a breath, both with the same building, seconds apart. The mechanism behind it is almost elegant, in a cold, forensic sense. Surface area determines combustion speed. A grain kernel burns slowly because oxygen only reaches its exterior. Aerosolized dust removes that limitation entirely. Every particle exposed, every particle igniting independently, all of it compounding into pressure, with nowhere to escape except through the walls holding it in. That's the paradox investigators kept circling back to. The violence didn't come from some exotic industrial chemical, some rare compound, some unpredictable reactive failure. It came from food. From the ordinary physics of surface area and confinement, scaled up until the numbers stopped sounding survivable. Without continuous ventilation to disperse settling particulate, every enclosed volume of air inside that plant functioned, structurally speaking, as the compression chamber of a bomb. Not metaphorically, mechanically. There was no room in that structure that morning that hadn't quietly become part of the same device. And somewhere inside that compression chamber, at the moment of failure, there were still people. The scale of this destruction was so total that it rewritten the safety codes for industrial engineering. If you find this level of forensic detail vital, join our community of 1% who study the science of disaster. Subscribe to Forensic Protocol now. It helps us keep these forgotten records alive. The 250-foot tower didn't fall outward. It collapsed inward, onto itself. The way structures do when the failure is total rather than partial, every floor giving way into the one beneath it, compressing decades of steel and grain and human routine into a single mound. That mound reached 120 feet high when it finally settled. Concrete, twisted rebar, machinery, and, somewhere within it, the people who had been standing at their stations less than a minute earlier. At least 6 individuals were confirmed killed in the immediate blast zone. The ones close enough to the primary detonation, or caught directly beneath the collapsing tower, for their deaths to be established almost instantly. But 6 was only the beginning of the count. Over 20 more were unaccounted for in the hours after the collapse. Not confirmed dead, not confirmed alive. Simply gone from the record, swallowed into a structure that no longer resembled the building it had been that morning. I want to be precise about what that collapse physically does to a human body, because the clinical language matters here more than the dramatic version. This wasn't just falling debris, it was industrial compression on a scale that turns reinforced concrete into a liquid force. When 250 feet of structure comes down in seconds, the force involved isn't comparable to a fire, it's tons of material closing over open space faster than a body can react, faster than escape is physically possible. For those caught directly in its footprint, death came from immediate blunt trauma, or from the slower horror of survivable injury beneath tons of material, cellular starvation setting in as rescue crews worked against a mound that took days to search. Crews recovered 32 bodies from that rubble in the initial search. 4 more remained trapped beneath the debris. Unreachable in the immediate aftermath, the 120-foot mound functioning, in every practical sense, as a mass grave before recovery teams could fully clear it. This is the number that would eventually stand as the disaster's final toll, 36. 36 people who had been performing entirely ordinary tasks, monitoring equipment, walking familiar routes between silos, doing work they'd done 1,000 times without incident, until the ordinary stopped being safe in the space of a single ignition event. The physical destruction told one story, the names beneath the rubble told another, and forensic teams arriving on site would soon discover that reconstructing exactly what happened would prove almost as difficult as recovering the victims themselves. Investigators arriving at Westwego faced a scene that resisted analysis by its very nature. A 120-foot mound of pulverized concrete and twisted rebar doesn't preserve evidence the way a contained fire scene does. It obliterates it. Commissioner Dozier's conclusion about the unloaded conveyor belt stood as the most specific finding to emerge from the wreckage. A mechanical anomaly precisely identified, clearly stated, highly likely, he'd said, not certain, likely. That qualifier matters. And it matters because of what the destruction itself had done to the evidence. Fire and explosive force don't just kill. They consumed the very material that would explain the killing. The exact bearing that overheated, the exact spark that crossed the gap between friction and ignition, those details existed for a fraction of a second before being vaporized in the very event they caused. This is the frustrating, honest core of forensic combustion analysis. You can identify the conditions. You can identify the mechanism. You can rarely point to the single isolated moment of ignition with total certainty, because that moment destroys itself in the act of occurring. Grain safety expert Schoaf's assessment, made years after the fact but rooted in the same body of forensic knowledge investigators drew from at Westwego, remains the clearest summary available. There is no foolproof method for preventing these explosions, because the ignition sources are numerous, and the fuel is nearly impossible to fully eliminate from a working grain facility. Investigators sifted through that rubble mound methodically anyway, documenting fracture patterns in the concrete, mapping the direction pressure had traveled through collapsed silo walls, cross-referencing the unloaded conveyor belt, finding against the physical damage patterns radiating outward from what appeared to be the primary ignition point. What emerged wasn't a single smoking gun, it was a confluence, systemic failure operating across multiple points simultaneously. An unladen belt generating friction it should never have generated, dust accumulation that had gone unaddressed for an unknown period, insufficient dispersion ventilation throughout the facility's air volume. None of these conditions alone would have killed anyone. Together, they built a structure that was, in the forensic record's own clinical language, functioning as a compression chamber long before anyone lit the fuse. The final death toll was confirmed at 36, and that number, cold, specific, unchanging, would soon place Westwego in a category no facility wants to occupy in the history of industrial catastrophe. 4 decades later, filmmaker Roy Anderson screened a 30-minute documentary titled The Continental Grain Elevator Explosion at a Jefferson Parish library on the anniversary of the blast. His conclusion, delivered without embellishment, was direct. It was the most deadly grain dust explosion in modern history. Not the largest facility, not the most publicized, the deadliest. Sit with that distinction for a moment, because it isn't a matter of opinion. It's a forensic ranking, built from decades of comparable industrial incidents across the country. Comparable belts, comparable dust, comparable silos, none of which produced a body count that reached Westwego's number. The legal record left its own account of the human cost. A negligence lawsuit totaling $114,100,000 was filed in federal district court, citing 34 deaths tied directly to the explosion and the fire that followed it. The families behind that filing weren't seeking abstraction. They were seeking accountability for an unladen conveyor belt, for dust that accumulated without adequate ventilation, for a systemic failure that had been, according to safety protocols already in place at the time, entirely preventable. Courtrooms deal in different evidence than forensic labs, where investigators spoke in probabilities, highly likely, no foolproof method. The lawsuit spoke in dollar figures and death counts, translating physics into liability, translating an overheated bearing into a number a jury could weigh. The forensic conclusion, when investigators finally closed the file, confirmed what the physical evidence had suggested from the earliest days of the search. A primary spark, its exact origin never isolated with total certainty, but its most probable source identified as friction from that unladen belt, ignited suspended dust within the enclosed volume of the silo structure. That ignition dispersed additional fuel through the pressure wave it generated, filling 48 of the 73 silos with an aerosolized concentration of combustible particulate. The secondary detonation that followed exceeded the structural tolerance of reinforced concrete by a margin investigators struggled to fully quantify, collapsing the 250-foot main tower into a 120-foot mound of rubble. 36 people died in that collapse. The anomaly that triggered it was never reduced to a single named cause with absolute certainty, only to a probability, a highly likely, spoken by a commissioner standing over wreckage that had already destroyed its own clearest evidence. What remained certain was the physics. Grain dust, suspended and confined, behaves like a weapon regardless of intent. No malice required, no unusual failure required. Only ordinary friction, ordinary dust, and an ordinary morning that ended in a mass grave built from the very grain those 36 people had spent their lives moving. The Westwego tragedy remains a definitive lesson in how invisible physics becomes visible catastrophe. If you value this level of forensic depth, join our community of investigators by subscribing to Forensic Protocol. Don't let these records be forgotten. I'll see you in the next analysis.